Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm Bob Sessions, retired professor of philosophy. If you've been paying attention at all, you know that Iowa has a water problem. Not the California problem of too little water. Instead, we're plagued with water pollution. Municipalities are required to deliver clean water back into the Iowa's rivers when it goes through treatment plants. The main sources of pollution, therefore, are municipal and agricultural runoff. This morning, we are going to focus on agricultural runoff, both from the crop and the livestock production. Last May, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Army Corps of Engineers finalized a new clean water rule. This update of the 1972 Clean Water Act clarifies which streams and wetlands are protected under the law. It states that streams do not contribute flow to downstream waters, irrigation ditches, waste treatment lagoons, agricultural, stormwater runoff, and groundwater are not included. For 2 years now, Iowa has pushed a volunteer nutrient reduction strategy to deal with agriculture's contributions to our polluted waterways. Increasingly, this strategy has come under fire as inadequate, which the largest volley coming from the City of Des Moines Waterworks Department, suing 3 counties upstream for the cost of purifying the capital city's water of farm chemicals. With us today are 3 people who agree that we have a serious water quality issue in Iowa, but who have differing views about how to solve them. On my left is Curt Zingula, who is a Cedar Rapids area farmer and a member of the Farm Bureau, and has introduced water protection strategies to his farming practices, such as buffer strips and cover crops, and he believes the volunteer strategy will work in time if enough resources are available to help farmers practice good water stewardship. Next to him is Francis Thicke from Fairfield. He's an organic farmer and soil scientist who ran for Iowa Secretary of Agriculture a few years back and is a strong critic of this volunteer strategy. And then finally, Ron Corbett, whom I'm sure many of you know or know of, Mayor of Cedar Rapids. And recently, he has helped to organize the Iowa Partnership for Clean Water, a group that is striving to get all interested parties to work together to make the volunteer strategy work. I'd like to begin with 2 things very briefly. We could spend the whole morning on either of them, but I want to get them out of the way so we can get to the issue of, okay, what do we do? Because I think we all agree there are some serious problems there that need to be addressed. The first thing I'd like each of you to comment on briefly is, why do we care? What's wrong with the particular materials, the chemicals and so on, they're getting into the water? What damage is it causing? Why are we being asked to clean it up? So, Curt?
Well, I think the first aspect that we have to look at is nitrates and phosphorus in our streams. Now, we've all heard about the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit, as you said, Bob, and they're concerned about nitrates and having the cost of filtering nitrates. Perhaps a bigger concern is the amount of nutrient pollution in regards to algae formation and also the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. For our lakes and reservoirs, nitrogen and phosphorus have caused considerable algae blooms, and this is actually, the algae is actually the #1 impairment for lakes and reservoirs.
Okay. And that affects recreation, that affects drinking water?
Right. Probably not drinking water so much. Our drinking water is pretty much all filtered. And as far as nitrates and phosphorus are concerned, whatever little bit a swimmer might take in from swimming, that's really a non-event. It's the algae just causing an undesirable recreational venue.
So Francis, your point of view?
Yeah, I think that Curt's right. It's nitrogen and phosphorus, and the phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in lakes. And so when more phosphorus comes in the lakes, the algae blooms grow. Now nitrate is the limiting nutrient in rivers and estuaries like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So as more nitrate is put in, that causes the problems in the rivers in the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course the nitrate is a concern for drinking water. If it gets above a certain level of 10 parts per million, then it has to be treated.
And it's expensive. That's why the Des Moines Water Works is suing these counties, is because they're having a lot of extra expense because of that nutrient. So there's an issue
Exactly.
there. Mayor?
Well, certainly there's a lot of reasons for people to be concerned about clean water. One is because we drink it every day, and so the public sources of water, like a Cedar Rapids Water Department, people get up every morning and they turn on the faucet, and when they take a drink of water and make their coffee or brush their teeth, they want to make sure that it's safe. And that's the responsibility of the public systems like Cedar Rapids and Des Moines. Every community handles that themselves depending on where they get their source water from. From Cedar Rapids standpoint, we get ours from the aquifer. Also, as the two panelists already mentioned, recreation. So you have boating, when people think of recreation, of boating and swimming, but there's also hunting and fishing. And particularly the fishing industry in Iowa is hurt when the population of our species, whether they be trout or largemouth bass, are on a decline.
And ironically, one of the groups that's hurt most are farmers of sorts down at the bottom of the Mississippi River, because the dead zone means that the fish and shrimp and so on down there can't get the oxygen they need, and so the people who are farming in that way are being hurt with their livelihood. So it affects people all the way down to the bottom. By the way, just for everybody's information, I've read that virtually every major river in the world has this dead zone problem because of various kinds of runoff.
And to clarify for the listeners, the dead zone is caused by algae blooms, and then when the algae die and decompose, that robs the water of oxygen. So a lot of people don't really understand how that works.
Yeah. Something also that's hard to understand, I think, is this recent EPA ruling. I'm reading various things on it. Maybe we'll start with you, Ron. What's your perspective on exactly what it is they're saying, and how does it clarify or not clarify the Clean Water Act of 1972?
Well, regulating a public drinking source like the Cedar Rapids Water Department is different than regulating a farm field. We are getting that water, obviously, to our customers, consumers in the area, and we certainly have to make sure that it's clean and safe, and why we continually upgrade our public infrastructure, which is oftentimes water mains that go to the various neighborhoods, but also we just had a disinfection system put in, ultraviolet, that cost the city of Cedar Rapids a lot of money, $37 million. But we do that as the overall greater good of our community, and we absorb those costs, obviously, through the ratepayers, but we also see the benefit by greater economic growth of more homes and more businesses in Cedar Rapids.
Francis?
Well, I think this controversy on the EPA rules is really making a mountain out of a molehill, because EPA is given the task of protecting our waters and defining which waters to protect by the law, as the law defines. And there's been some controversy, so EPA put out a new rule to clarify that. And they've actually, in the rule, they've taken away some of the things that were a concern, like regular farming activities. Ditches, waterways in the farms are exempt. And so they thought that should satisfy the farmers, but some farm organizations have really taken it and made a snowball out of it, and the farmers often don't understand it. They just repeat, ditch the rule kind of things that the farm organizations have put out. So the truth is, it actually is not any worse than it was before for farmers. It's not going to cause any changes in their farming operations.
Well, I'll have to disagree with Francis on this. I think it is a mountain. The Clean Water Act basically was restricted to navigable waters, and the rule that EPA has come up with now, the waters of the U.S., WOTUS, will in the state of Iowa cover 99, almost 100% of farmland. So all of a sudden now a lot of farmers do have to have a concern. Now, environmentalists will say those lands, those waters, that land use should be covered. The concern here from a farmer standpoint is how the EPA has approached this. In district court just last week, it was ruled that the EPA has violated the Clean Water Act. They violated Administrative Procedures Act. Add to that the fact that there's a Wyoming farmer now facing a $16 million fine from the EPA for building a stock pond, of which he obtained all the permits. And we feel we have reason to be concerned when the EPA acts in this overreach manner.
Okay, Francis, do you want to respond?
Actually, the rules are for navigable waters and any tributaries to them, anything that has to have a bed and a bank and an ordinary high water mark. So it does not affect farming operations. And if you dredge, however, if you dredge something and put it in these tributaries, then you are affecting it. So I don't know what the person in this place did, but in normal farming operations, it will not affect it.
It's everyone's problem. It isn't just the rural areas or the urban areas, because there are a lot of parking lots, a lot of street. There's urban runoff too that goes into a lot of these tributaries, and why we've been trying to put bioswales, detention basins to hold the water back in some of our new developments around the community, and even just recently at Knowledge Park, putting a vegetative swale in there to hold back and retain some of the water as it comes off that Collins Road watershed. So this isn't an issue where, you know, it's the rural people's fault or the urban people's fault, and to get into this finger pointing. And that's why this cooperative way is really the best way. So for the city of Cedar Rapids, we were a lead grantor for a big partnership of 14, 15 different organizations, from private sector companies like DuPont to farm interest groups like the Iowa Soybean Association, to conservation boards working with Benton County, Tama County, Blackhawk County on demonstration projects. Because the thing about the EPA and like a statewide regulation, it doesn't work. Every farm field is different, and the farm land is different from northern Iowa to southern Iowa. So it really has to be addressed watershed by watershed, field by field.
Let's talk about the voluntary strategy. One of the things that none of you mentioned is that nitrogen and phosphorus cost a lot of money, okay? So if it's leaching off of farm fields because of heavy rains or poor practices or whatever it might be, it's costing farmers money. So I think it's to the farmers' benefit, as well as the rest of us, that there be as little of that kind of runoff as possible. And we'll talk about the runoff from animal practices a little bit later. But what's going on now with the nutrient reduction strategy? You know, how is it working? How many people are involved? What strategies are being used? What difficulties? Because as you say, there are many, many different situations. You want to address that?
Sure. The reduction strategy is really not something you sign up for. It's a promotion, and above all else, it needs to be an educational promotion. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding as far as how to actually control the nitrogen fertilizers. The fertilizer I put on, the nitrogen I put on, is very, very stable. It's only when the bacteria in the soil break it down into a nitrate form that it becomes unstable and then leaches out through subsurface drainage tile lines. Phosphorus, on the other hand, is stable. I think we need to have more of an educational effort that 80% of the phosphorus that it goes into streams goes in attached to a soil particle. So it's an erosion factor. And I think there needs to be more emphasis, more learning, how to use no-till and reduce tillage so that we can keep that soil on the farm, and by doing so still keep the phosphorus there as well.
Maybe say a little bit about what practices you've implemented on your farm.
Well, for the phosphorus, certainly reducing tillage. 3 years ago, I switched over to planting corn no-till into bean stubble. I still use just a little bit of light tillage on corn stalks ahead of planting into that. I like to use a little tillage to remove weeds rather than have to use a spraying method and cost. So I'm not totally no-till, but moving that way. That will greatly reduce erosion and the loss of phosphorus. For nitrogen, I think the best thing I can do at this point is to use a nitrogen inhibitor, a nitrification inhibitor. And a lot of farmers are moving this way. We had been taught for years that it was not cost effective to use a nitrification inhibitor in the spring. But now I just talked to my co-op agronomist this morning, and he's telling me that 2/3 of their customers are using that inhibitor, and it's about $8 or $9 an acre. So it can get very pricey, you know, if you've got, say, 1,000 acres worth of corn. So farmers are using that method of control, even though they don't really, they're not sure that there will be an economic benefit. But a lot of the farmers just feel that this is the right thing to do to be able to try and keep nitrates out of the streams.
Francis, you're a soil scientist. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, one thing that needs to be clear is that just managing our nitrogen fertilizer more efficiently is only going to get us about 10% of the way to the goal. Because there's a misconception that farmers the cause is too much nitrogen fertilizer. The problem really is that the corn-soybean crop rotation is fundamentally inherently flawed in that it is inherently leaky. Because it's only they're annual crops, they only have roots in the ground, live roots in the ground for about 5 months of the year. The rest of the year there are no live roots in the ground, and the soil is very dynamic, and a lot of nitrogen is circulating and cycling. And the nitrate, in a normal prairie, for example, when nitrate is released, as Curt mentioned, in this form that can leach, the plants will grab it right away, year-round. And the research shows that in prairie systems, there's virtually no nitrogen leaching. But when you have annual crops, there's this big part of the year where there's nothing to grab the nitrogen and it leaks. And so that's the key thing. We have to have something to scavenge that nitrogen, either cover crops or more perennial crops in the system, or else we need to have something like wetlands or bioreactors that can catch it at the end of the tile lines and process it, denitrify it back in the atmosphere. So that's the key thing, I think, is that it's not just making our nitrogen fertilizer more efficient. We have to fix the whole system because it's inherently leaky of nitrogen.
Well, Curt, you've been using both cover crops and leaching fields, right?
Well, actually, I'm moving in that direction. I have a demonstration plot that I've started in conjunction, in collaboration with the Indian Creek watershed people, the authority. And I started this year with just testing under my normal farming practices. We're testing 2 outlets, one on each side of the field. And then in 2 years' time, actually starting the end of next year, we'll incorporate the conservation practices. One side of the field is expected to get a saturated buffer, the other side will have cover crops. And then after 2 years of testing the tile outlets without those conservation practices, then we will test them for 2 years after installing the conservation practices. One of the things that I want to try and do is bring the situation right into my neighbors' backyards. A lot of farmers, including myself, will look at the problems with the Des Moines Water Works. Okay, that's clear across the state. That's another farmer's problem. You know, they're causing a problem. But I think we need to bring this in closer to get farmers involved. They need to see something going on right in their backyard.
One of the things that we are doing at the City of Cedar Rapids, a lot of people don't know that the airport sits on 2,000 acres. So the city owns this farmland, and we contract that out with some of the legacy farmers. But this last year we took 100 acres and put it at miscanthus grass to do both, control some of the runoff, but also to provide some biofuel to the University of Iowa. And then we worked with Iowa State to plant another 100 acres or so in prairie strips. Similar to what Curt's doing, he's trying to do some demonstration and testing to see what the results are going to be, whether they're going to be positive, neutral, or maybe in some cases are negative. We don't know. We don't go in with any preconceived notions. We just go in with the idea that this is something we're going to try. It looks like it's worked in other areas of the state. Iowa State's been very successful at it. And as we did this, it was interesting that we got more interest about moving further with ideas of no-till. And that's probably where the direction that we're going to with the 2,000 acres, that we have farm at the City of Cedar Rapids. But more importantly, it's really working with the farmers both upstream and downstream. Our airport sits on 2 watersheds, Cedar River, Iowa River. And it's our responsibility not just to worry about what comes downstream, but what goes downstream.
Bob, could I add something here? I really need to emphasize the educational part of this. As far as cover crops go, Francis is a big advocate of cover crops, and I think they're a good thing also. But in November of 2013, I got on the web and I searched for cover crop information. I found that Iowa State was doing some testing, and they were disappointed in their results as far as how much cover crop growth they were getting. And Iowa State says, well, we need to go back to the drawing board and find out what we're doing wrong. Well, from my viewpoint as a farmer, that's not very encouraging for me to get into something like cover crops. I want to see some positive results before I really spend tens of thousands of dollars on it. Earlier this summer, I was on a conservation tour, and we were viewing a cellulosic bioreactor. It was a cost share project, and the engineer for it stated that he appreciated the fact that this was a cost share project because it allowed him to learn how to install a bioreactor. Now, in my own situation, I just said that I'm going to put in a saturated buffer. I asked for an engineering review in February. It took 6 months before the engineer came out to even view the field and see whether or not this was going to be feasible.
Is somebody from Iowa State?
No, it was from NRCS, one of their engineers. And that engineer said to me, well, he said, sorry to take so long. I'm the only one in Linn County that's doing a project like this, and it took 6 months. But he says, sorry to take so long, but this is a learning experience for me also. So a lot of people say, well, why hasn't this worked already? Why hasn't the voluntary reduction worked? Well, there's just a lot of education that needs to be done before we can forge ahead.
You're sort of into the next topic I wanted to get into, and that is, well, how are we doing? And do we have time to make this voluntary strategy work? I mean, a lot of farmers already are up to here, especially with lower crop prices and so on right now. And it's very difficult to take on another expense and to find the time to educate themselves and so on without some real pressure, and also, on the other hand, some real positive support, you know, money as well as education. How are we doing on those fronts?
Well, I worked at U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. in 1988, and we launched a voluntary national water quality initiative, and with research, education, technical assistance, financial assistance, very comprehensive. And the idea was, in 5 years, if we didn't get some good results, we need to look at regulation. And of course, I call it the voluntary merry-go-round of water quality, is that about every 5 or 10 years we get some new politicians who have a brilliant idea that we're going to have a voluntary program, and it never does it because the reason it doesn't do it is it costs money. It costs money for the farmers to do the practices, and so they're not going to volunteer. Only the innovators like Curt and others will do it. And the data shows only 1 or 2% of the farmers are really doing anything. I would like to take one more minute here and address what Ron said, is that every farm is different, so we can't have one size fits all. Well, that's why I think what we need is something like our soil conservation plans. Our soil conservation plans, every farm basically has one, and it uses what the farmers put their practices in a computer, and it tells them whether it's going to meet the tolerance value for soil erosion. I think we need to have water quality plans in every farm. Farmers can choose water quality practices that fit their farm, and the research data in a computer program will evaluate whether or not that's going to reach the tolerance level for nitrogen, the tolerance level for phosphorus. That's a very short way of describing it, but I think that's a flexible regulatory program that we could have.
How does that differ from what Curt's talking about? It has a regulatory aspect to it. That is, you have to get in the program, but you then have the voluntary...
you have flexibility.
How you're going to
use whatever practices fit your farm, but you have to have enough practices to make that T-value for nitrogen and for phosphorus.
Well, we have to consider, though, that 60% of the land being farmed is farmed by someone other than the owner. We have to bring the owners into the fold. The DNR and IDALS, the people who developed the nutrient reduction strategy, came up with, mostly Iowa State, came up with 4 practices that were going to have to carry the lion's share of nutrient reduction. 3 of those 4 are decisions and capital investments that will have to be conducted by the landowner. So I hate to disagree with Francis on this, but he needs to bring the landowner into this consideration as well.
That's a good point. However, in soil conservation plans, the landowner also has to be able to work. The landowner has to approve of it, and the conservation plan has to be in effect. So it has to involve both the landowner and the farmer. It would be the same thing.
So we've moved past, we're really at a shared understanding of there are some problems in the state, and not just Iowa, it's around the country, obviously. And there was a lot of effort put into the nutrient reduction strategy. It is voluntary, but everyone that I've talked to around the state, as I get around, they're probably more in favor of the voluntary than they are the regulatory approach, but it's voluntary plus some type of support in some of the cost share programs. I mean, I promote what Cedar Rapids is doing with the farmers north of us in the different watersheds, but we also, received a grant for a little over $4.2 million to help implement some of these practices. And so it's easy for me to say cooperation, but we also got the resources to allow us
But that's a drop in the bucket. The estimates for the nutrient reduction plan say, about $1 billion a year. We're talking $5–10 million. We're not going to get anywhere with that in a voluntary program. It sounds great, but it's not going to happen that way.
Well,
So where's the money going to come from, Francis? I mean, what's your plan for that?
Well, with soil conservation plans, farmers have to contour farm or don't till. They have to do practices. And if each farmer picks it up themselves, it's going to have to happen that way eventually. I can't see it going any other way. We cannot afford, as a society, $1 billion a year for Iowa farmers to cost share their practices. We cannot do that. It's really, the polluter has to pay.
But already, we are cost sharing.
We can cost share on the
city
side.
of Cedar Rapids, we've heard, and the city of Des Moines and so on,
Yes.
are paying for cleaning up the nitrogen that leaks into the waterways.
We
So,
can and should do some of that,
the
and
city
Curt is a good model for that, to demonstrate that, I think, and to cost share.
Yeah.
City of Des Moines takes it out, then they turn around and put it back in the.
It's
in
minuscule,
their-
minuscule.
They still do it, and they do bring up their cost factor, but certainly we have cost in our city. We just put a plan together to spend $3 million a year for curb cuts for handicap accessible to meet ADA regulation, but we're not out suing other people to help us absorb that cost, and that's really the problem I have with the Des Moines Water Works is, the suing. They picked a couple poor counties in areas where they aren't going to have the legal resources to defend themselves, so they're out, begging for resources to help in that effort in the court system. Right. It could get tied up for years and appealed, and that doesn't help anyone. It doesn't really move the ball in the direction that I think a majority of Iowans want, is cooperative efforts.
It starts a conversation, and it's got a lot of people doing things that they wouldn't have done otherwise.
Well, I think it started some more of a statewide conversation. And what it also helped is that also farmers aren't necessarily out there bragging about all the conservation practices they're doing. I've been amazed just on the Lynn County tour I took, and what I hear from other people as they give me feedback, how much farmers are doing. Just people didn't really know. There isn't a story every day in the Des Moines Register about what a farmer's doing, but there is a daily count on how many days that the waterworks had to use their nitrate removal system. I wish they'd also every day show a farmer out there and what they've done to prevent pollution in the waterways.
Well, it is way over the 1% to 2% that Francis mentioned. That number of people are taking advantage of the IDAL's cost shares for the nutrient reduction. But the conservation measures that farmers have been doing, from reducing tillage to building grass waterways, and
have been changes.
It's quite substantial.
Gentlemen, we could go on a long time, but we have run out of time. I very much appreciate you being here this morning, Curt Zingula and Francis Thicke and Mayor Ron Corbett. This is very, very interesting, and thank you for joining us on Ethical Perspectives on the News.
Thank you.
Thank you.